be with you.
Ah, yes. The 40s and early 50s were a great time of music. For the oldies.
Heavy metal thunder, racing with the wind, and the feeling that I'm under.
Okay, that's more like it. The mid-50s were an incredible time because it's when music, its sound and style suddenly changed with the invention of rock and roll. But how did music evolve so quickly? The answer is simple. Chuck Berry, the father of rock and roll. This guy. In northern St. Louis, 1926, Charles Edward Anderson Berry entered the world. Being a middle-class African American, he was an underdog to being one of the most major inspirations to the musical industry. While attending Sumner High School, he was introduced to his musical career performing for the first time in public in 1941 at a high school assembly. He enjoyed the music and eventually learned to play not only guitar, but saxophone, bass, drums, and vocals as well. In his 20s, he started performing at nightclubs and parties, and then joined the Sir Johnson Trio. Although the musical era was focused on jazz and blues, he learned a few new funky styles, including hillbilly music or boogie woogie, which was the first country. His band would regularly play the common music, but at times he would add a hillbilly song with some more exciting Western guitar licks. This style was considered white music, and the sight of Chuck Berry, a black person, jamming it out intrigued the crowd. Johnny Johnson was his band leader, but the spotlight suddenly turned to Mr. Berry. He was constantly experimenting with new sounds that he didn't know would be the future of music. His next step was to get recorded. He was hoping to get signed by Chess Records, so he met up with Leonard Chess, the founder. Chuck Berry played many blues songs for him, but they were not the songs that impressed him. It was a remake of the country song Ida Red that caught his attention. In this song, his first single, he used its original country guitar riffs, but put it over a jumpy bass of rhythm and blues. Mr. Berry changed the lyrics, singing an interesting story about cars and young love, and retitled it Maybelline. Maybelline was released in 1955 and quickly rose to the top of the charts. This song was the world's first taste of rock and roll, and they loved it. Chuck Berry, being the musical genius he is, simply combined the sounds of two styles, creating a distinguishable, bright, swift, lively sound. Now that he knew the code to rock and roll, he could write originals of his own, including Sweet Little 16 and Johnny Be Good.
We call it rock, we call it, boogie joogie, we call it rhythm and blues, call it what you may. Man, I play what I feel, and I love what I feel.
A leader is someone who inspires others to follow. John Lennon of the Beatles, the most popular rock and roll band of all time, famously quoted, "If you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry." John Lennon said this because he and thousands of his peers followed Chuck Berry and were fully inspired by him. When any rock and roll artist sits down to write a song, they begin with Chuck Berry's core music. Chuck Berry is a true musical leader. He has proven to be the heartbeat and most influential person in rock and roll history. As a black man, making his sound famous was a hard thing to do. But with Chuck Berry's amazing contributions to rock and roll, attention found him. His original sound was immediately recognized, and it was exciting to all the teenagers and was like a call to the world to get up and dance. They are still dancing today to the loved sound of rock and roll. There were many performers that also contributed to rock and roll, but he started it all.
And I went, Chuck Berry, my hero, he just came out, I don't think there's any group in the world, white or black, but mainly the white kids were really turned on by Chuck Berry, and not one of us from Beatles to Stones. You name any top group, and they've all been influenced by him. He's the greatest rock and roll poet, and I really admire him.
Chuck Berry was not the most famous rock and roll performer. When listing rock and roll's originals, Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones are probably the first to come to mind. Even though Chuck Berry invented rock and roll, he was less known, and these famous stars who copied him and envied his style and technique became the rock and roll immortals. Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Imitation is Chuck Berry's legacy. because his work inspired so many great musicians and is still the foundation of today's rock and roll. It was the sound he left behind, a sound that would turn into a rock and roll era. Without Chuck Berry, there may have been no rock and roll. The whole evolution of music would have been much flatter without him. The countless rock stars he inspired may have never become famous, and their contributing factors to rock and roll would not exist. Even if rock and roll isn't your favorite music, pop, rap, new wave, punk, reggae, and countless other forms of music we listen to today were fueled by rock and roll, which was fueled by Chuck Berry. In 1986, Chuck Berry's importance was recognized, as he was the very first person inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was introduced by Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones.
This is the gentleman that started it all, as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to greet Mr. Chuck Berry here right now.
A lot of Chuck Berry's legacy can be shown through similarities between his music and the music of other people that copied him. I want you to listen to one of the most famous rock and roll songs by the Beatles, Twist and Shout, and compare it to an earlier song by Chuck Berry, Roll Over Beethoven. Now, listen closely to the background music of the karaoke version of Twist and Shout. Now listen for the similarities in Chuck Berry's original piece, Roll Over Beethoven. The Beatles were definitely influenced by him. If you know rock and roll, you know how essential the guitar solo is. Every great rock and roll song has one. Chuck Berry invented it, and it was copied the minute it came out and is still being copied today. Here's the guitar solo in Johnny Be Good. Now listen to the legendary guitar solo in Crazy Train. Even though this guitar solo was played with a distorted sound, it is still the same kind of guitar playing that Chuck Berry invented. Johnny Be Good was released in the 1950s, and Crazy Train was released over 3 decades later. His original technique was used in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and is still being used today. Elvis was known as the king of rock and roll, but without Chuck Berry's influence, he would just be another blues singer. This song was released in 1954, a year before Chuck Berry invented rock and roll. When Elvis adopted Chuck Berry's sound, his career took off. This song was released in 1956, a year after Chuck Berry showed the world rock and roll. Notice a change? That was because of Chuck Berry. Elvis may have been the king of rock and roll, but Chuck Berry was the father of the rock and roll family, and the rest is history. Chuck Berry not only influenced rock and roll, but he still influences our everyday life. Rock and roll is our culture and the identity of our nation. Rock and roll influenced the youth of every generation since the 50s. It has been a source of personal expression, political movements, and most importantly, a source of everyday joy. And for that, our nation owes gratitude to Chuck Berry. He mixed 2 styles, blues, which was black music, and country, which was white music, and meshed it together to create an awesome, popular sound. This sound introduced black and white audiences to raceless music. Eventually, both black and white performers came together to share the sound and share the audiences free from the barriers of race. Chuck Berry changed the sound. The sound changed the nation. Our nation, with rock and roll as its core, changed the world.
And long live rock and roll!
Can't you be true?